Good evening, everyone joining us here in Beirut, in the audience at the Phoenicia Hotel. It's wonderful to see this hotel reopened. It's gone through quite a few moments of destruction and reconstruction, so I'm thrilled to actually be physically here. And welcome to all of those joining us online as well, from Washington and elsewhere. This is the last session of the two-day yearly conference of the Middle East Center of the Carnegie Endowment. Thank you for being here till the end. I will bring the conference to a close with a discussion centered around an overarching question. Does the United States have a future in the Middle East? It's a question many of us have been asking repeatedly over the last few years, with many variations on the headline. The US is on the way out, the US is disengaging, the US is retreating, the US is deprioritizing the region. In my opinion, when it comes to the Biden administration, it is right-sizing the energy that it devotes to the region. The Middle East has long absorbed, I think, too much of the focus of American administrations and its resources, going back to the Eisenhower Doctrine of 1957, and its commitment at the time to secure its vital interests in the Middle East. And needless to say, much has changed since then in the region and in the Middle East. But is there today a way around America? Can Russia or China really replace it? And how do regional players navigate this? And how should the US look at the region today? With me to discuss all of this, we have Sinan Ülgen, to my right, from Turkey, a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe. Next to him is Dr. Abdullah Baabood, academic from Oman, who specializes in the Gulf and the Middle East issues, and he's a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center. Joining us from Washington is Zaha Hassan, a human rights attorney and specialist on Palestinian affairs and a fellow at Carnegie. And also joining us shortly, virtually, he's running a few minutes late, Karim Sadjadpour, who will speak on Iran. He's a fellow at Carnegie and will be joining from Washington, D.C. in a moment as well. I'm going to start by asking all of the panelists the same question as it applies to their area of expertise. And that's the question that makes the title of our panel. Does the United States have a future in the Middle East? And I'll ask you to be a little bit brief, but you don't have to be too brief. And what we'll do a little bit of a lightning round, and we can unpack as we go along. And Abdullah, I'll start with you. Xi Jinping is visiting Riyadh. What does that tell us about America's future and its place in the region?
Thank you, Kiman. Good afternoon, everybody. I think the visit itself is very significant because it basically resembles the changing times that we are witnessing now. China had been for a very long time almost an enemy of the monarchies, where it was supporting some of the communist revolutions in the past. But since the change that took place in China and the change that has taken place in the global economy and the change that's taking place in the Middle East and the Gulf states, we have seen a building of relationship where China is now the major trade partner and economic partner for Middle Eastern states, and particularly for the Gulf states, because most of the Gulf states' energy is now shifting towards Asia, China in particular. And as the center of economic gravity is moving east, the Gulf states, the Middle East, also is pivoting east. It's not just the United States; it's also the whole region is pivoting east. And this visit is significant because it came just 2 months after President Biden came to Riyadh, and the way that Biden was treated and the way that Xi Jinping is treated, it just tells us, what the story is. The story is China is seen as the future partner for the Gulf states in many respects. In fact, allow me just to say that China makes actually an example for what a governing system, successful governing system could be. Because the Middle Eastern states, the Gulf states, are the last thing they want to see democracy happening, and they don't want to see United States or European system being imposed on them, human rights and all of that. China does not care about that. China is one-party system, and they see it as a model for their future role. That's one thing. The other thing is they see the way that China has been running its economy, state-led economy, state-owned enterprises, is another economic model. And in the lack of any future democratic movement in the region or any future even economic model in the region, China will continue to be the model, the future model, the current model and the future model where the Gulf states, the Middle Eastern states look up to.
I'm going to challenge you on that a bit later on in the panel about China as a model, because we've seen the protests in China as well.
Sure.
But I want to follow up very quickly on how you portray China as the partner. Is it the only partner? Where does that actually leave the US in the eyes of Gulf countries?
For particularly for the Gulf states, but I think this goes also a long way to other Middle Eastern states. They see that the rise of China or even Russia as an opportunity. They see that the bipolar or the multipolar system, and that is a possibility, is an opportunity for smaller states to operate. They don't like to be under the umbrella or the total umbrella and the total control of one hegemonic power. And they see that there is an opportunity that they can serve their own best national interest by dealing with competitive powers in the world and getting the best of them, especially as the United States has been seen as a partner that has not been credible, at least in the eyes of the leaders in the region. It has not been, it has not acted when it was supposed to protect the region, given the fact that it's a security guarantor. It has not even helped in the way that the region economic development needs, the technological and economic support and investment from the United States. It's been seen by the United States as just a market for their arms sales, and also that comes with not without so many conditions. So they have seen that they have been neglected, the benign neglect, if you like, by the United States and also by European powers to a certain extent. And they see this is another opportunity where they can actually trade, There are no conditions attached to their trade. There is also cultural issues and cultural affinity involved with China and the East, and they like the idea that there are other players and they have agency that they can play around and get and serve their best national interest.
Thank you. Sinan, over to you. Over the past years, there have been many disagreements between Ankara and Washington. It seems to be going from one disagreement to one crisis to the other. Does Ankara think that the US has a role in the region? That it should have a role in the region? How do you see, from Ankara's perspective, the role of America in the Middle East?
Well, let me start by saying that Turkey is in a special case because Turkey is an ally, is a formal ally, it's a NATO country. Having said that, the relationship over the past decade, really, when you look at it, belies that status. Yes, Turkey and the US has a formal alliance, but when you look at the aggregation of bilateral problems, it is as if they are not allied, but they have really transformed the relationship into a purely transactional relationship. Turkey is under sanctions, for instance, on the military side. And so ultimately, the perception in Ankara, despite Turkey being a NATO ally, is not that much different from the other countries in the Middle East in the sense of judging the future role of the US in the system of countries. And here I want to refer to all the debate that's been raging about, the systemic change, global power competition. This is very much so the debate that we're having in many of the Western capitals. It's also illustrated in the newly issued US national security strategy. But that also has an impact in the region. If the US looks at the world in terms of big power competition, the regional countries also look at the world in terms of big power competition. And there, in game theoretic terms, the dominant strategy becomes a strategy of hedging. It does not become a strategy of alliance, essentially because of the systemic difficulties that the US has in terms of engaging with the countries. And I will name three here. One is the tenacity of the US commitment to the region, the temporal aspect. There are doubts about how long this engagement can be sustained. And especially in a world where the US has pivoted to Asia and all the strategic focus has turned to China. So there's one. Two is the credibility of the US commitment. And this is already something that was alluded to. We see this, for instance, very clearly with Afghanistan. Overnight, there's a decision to pull back. There was another decision in Syria where the US president, decided to pull back, but institutionally things changed afterwards. And the third thing is the validity of the US commitment. So even if, the first two problems are addressed, it is still uncertain whether what the countries hear from the US leadership is actually going to be delivered for a host of reasons. So when you have all of these systemic problems, insofar as appreciating and evaluating the US commitment to the region, the dominant strategy becomes one of hedging between big powers. And yesterday, actually, there was a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs by Michael Singh, who actually used a very good analogy. Said that during the Cold War, many of the countries were non-aligned, part of the non-aligned movement. Today, these countries, especially in the Middle East region, have opted for a strategy of not non-alignment but omni-alignment, meaning that they are aligned with different poles of power at the same time. And for a host of reasons, that makes sense. Now, what are the implications going forward of that strategy of omni-alignment? We can talk about. But this is, in a nutshell, how I think the region views the future of US role in the region.
I like that omni-alignment. It's interesting.
I did like it too, yes.
Yeah, we'll get back to that for sure. Zaha, in Washington, the question for you or for the file that you look at is perhaps not so much is there a future for the US, but is there any future hope for the Palestinians aiming for a two-state solution or any other potential positive development without the US being at the table, without the US shepherding the process? And that is despite the very many failures of diplomacy and American engagement on this file in the past.
Good day, everyone. Good day, Kim, and good morning to folks here in Washington. You're absolutely right. In the context of Israel-Palestine, the U.S. is not pulling back at all from its engagement. On Israel, the U.S. is wholeheartedly committed to the 10-year MOU signed in 2016 that grants Israel, without any conditions attached, $38 billion, plus any additional money Israel needs. In fact, an additional $1 billion in new emergency funding was granted just this year to replenish missiles that Israel used during the May 2021 bombardment of Gaza. Israel is now formally within CENTCOM's area of responsibility, and an IDF liaison is stationed at CENTCOM. And new congressional initiatives are advanced every session that strengthen the Israeli-U.S. relationship and collaboration on research and development in various technologies and in joint security. The U.S. is also actively working to advance Israel's normalization in the Middle East and with Muslim-majority countries, as Secretary Blinken noted during his speech at the recent J Street conference, putting aside the opinion of Arab constituencies across the region, including in the Abraham Accord countries who strongly oppose normalization, and that was demonstrated rather categorically during the World Cup Games. It also is helping Israel to sign energy and water agreements with its Arab neighbors, including neighbors it doesn't have that don't have diplomatic relations with Israel. And of course, the U.S. is continuing to provide Israel with political and diplomatic cover at the UN and in other fora and contexts, which is preventing Israeli officials or even private entities from facing accountability for potential war crimes. And as for the Palestinians, the U.S.-Palestinian bilateral relationship is also actively being pursued, renewed, and ramped up. Hundreds of millions of dollars is now flowing to the Palestinian people in humanitarian and economic assistance. The U.S. is supporting people-to-people initiatives and joint enterprise between Israelis and Palestinians. And just this Thanksgiving holiday, the U.S. also appointed Hadi Ahmad as the first ever special representative for Palestinian affairs, something touted as an upgrade of bilateral relationship, though short of reopening the U.S. consulate that had served as a de facto embassy to Palestinians. Now, the problem with all this U.S. engagement is that it's operating on two separate and distinct tracks. A track for Israel that stands apart from any peace process with Palestinians, and another track for Palestinians that is completely derivative to a non-existent peace process and continued relations with Israel. The Palestinian bilateral relationship is contingent, while Israel's is ironclad. So Palestinian agency to pursue diplomatic or legal initiatives in support of a two-state outcome or to pursue accountability threatens the continuation of any U.S.-Palestinian relations. Palestinians should not apply to the UN to become a voting member. They should not support an ICJ advisory opinion on whether Israel's prolonged half-century occupation amounts to annexation and apartheid. And they may not seek accountability at the ICC for even something like an Israeli sniper killing of an American citizen. However, Israeli actions that take a wrecking ball to the prospects of a negotiated political solution and threaten escalations in violence, for example, by expanding settlements in very sensitive areas, allowing Jewish settlers to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound while restricting access to Muslims and Christians at their respective holy sites, or providing military cover for Israeli settlers when they go on rampages against Palestinians. These things do not warrant tangible political costs in terms of the U.S.-Israeli bilateral relationship. So the result of the siloed kind of U.S. policy toward Palestinians on the one hand and Israel on the other is to exacerbate tensions, undermine American credibility internationally, and expose hypocrisies which work to embolden the most hardline elements in Israeli society, like the Jewish supremacist political parties, Jewish power, and religious Zionism, which will now have cabinet positions likely in the next Israeli government.
I think I'll repeat the question. Zaha, the question was for you in Washington about whether the Palestinians see any alternative to the US on the global stage in terms of a global player, an international player that can support them in their aspirations.
Sorry, I lost the audio for a second there. No, actually, if you ask Palestinian officials, they'll tell you that there is no substitute for U.S. engagement, and even among the European actors and the EU, it's always a game of waiting for the U.S. lead with respect to the approach to take with Palestinians and Israel on the peacemaking file. So that becomes the dilemma for Palestinians, is how to encourage an approach by the U.S. that is rights respecting, conforms to international legal parameters, and will bring the Israelis to the table. Unfortunately, we aren't seeing yet in this current administration an interest in engaging on the peacemaking file. The approach seems to be more in a way of mitigating the escalations that take place periodically, in an attempt to try to deflect and not have to take on the peacemaking angle of the Palestinian-Israeli relationship.
Well, we'll return to that in a moment, but Karim Sadjadpour has just joined us, and I believe he's actually in New York. Karim, thanks very much for being with us. Now, the question I ask, or the question that the panel asks, does the US have a future in the Middle East, applies a little bit differently when it comes to Iran, because obviously the US and Iran don't have diplomatic relations. And yet there's perhaps no other country in the region where the US features so prominently in the calculations of the leadership, but also in the aspirations of the people. So how would you answer the question, what is the US role in the Middle East in the future?
So I think this is a big question, obviously, for the Gulf countries now, because the argument they make is that, on one hand, the United States makes clear to us that they want to downsize their presence in the Middle East, but at the same time, they tell us that we're not allowed to hedge our bets and talk and forge alliances or relationships and partnerships with countries like Russia and China. Obviously, Iran's current situation is different in that I would argue there's no government in the world over the last 4 decades which has had a more clear grand strategy to try to help bring down the US-led world order than the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in some ways, Iran's disposition has really forged America's alliances with Gulf partners over the last 4 decades. But if things start to change in Iran, and I'm not predicting they are, this is still a big if, but at some point I would argue the organizing principle of Iran's government will begin to evolve, rather than its organizing principle being this Shiite revolutionary ideology. When and if Iran starts to prioritize its own national interests, I would argue much of what they're doing in the Middle East today doesn't make sense in the context of the country's national interests, meaning that which is attempting to forward the security and prosperity of its people. Death to America, death to Israel won't make sense as an organizing principle. And I do think that a change in Iran's orientation from revolutionary cause to nation state would be the single most impactful geopolitical game changer in the region since the 1979 revolution in Iran.
And indeed, you have written many times, Karim, that one of the organizing principles and the foreign policy of the current Iranian leadership is, in essence, to push the US out of the region. The protests in Iran are a tricky moment. We don't know how they play out. They could play out over several months, a year. It took over a year and a half in the 70s to get to that moment of Ayatollah Khomeini's return to Iran. And the region and America are watching very closely, and in some cases, very silently. I noticed that Gulf countries are saying very little. And of course, it's also tricky for this one holy grail that the Biden administration and the Iranians had appeared to be pursuing, the JCPOA, a return to the JCPOA. In your perspective, Karim, how should the US engage or not on Iran, on this issue with Iran at the moment, in light of the protests unfolding inside Iran?
Well, at this moment, I think that Iran, as long as Iran is in a state of national uprising, it would be very unwise for the United States to attempt to try to revive the JCPOA, because essentially that would be meddling inside Iran to empower the regime against the population. So I think that that is the current US position. These negotiations are on ice. We could be in a different situation from now, but even in the event that the protests are repressed, which, these things, as you know very well, Kim, are totally unpredictable. But my view is that the United States needs to broaden its strategy toward Iran, and there essentially needs to be three pillars of a US strategy toward Iran. Yes, we have to counter and contain their nuclear ambitions. That's remains a pillar. Second, we have to counter and contain the regional ambitions. And third, we have to try to creatively and intelligently support the cause of representative government in Iran. This is a variation of the three-pronged strategy that worked very successfully vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And the last point I'll say on this is that I think up until now, over the last years, those who live inside the Middle East, the U.S. partners in the Gulf and Israel, would argue that the nuclear deal empowered Iran in the region because it unencumbered Iran financially. Iranians who work on human rights or democracy issues sometimes worry that the nuclear deal doesn't have any component which deals with that issue. It simply can empower, financially empower Iran's repressive apparatus. So this strategy needs to be conceived in a way in which these three pillars are mutually reinforcing and complementary. And the folks who work on regional issues or Iran domestic issues don't feel that their interests are sacrificed at the altar of trying to get a nuclear deal, which has been, I think, the policy up until now.
Thanks, Karim. And Abdullah, that leads me back to you, because the deal with Iran that the Obama administration struck was part of the reason why the rift grew between the US and Gulf countries. They felt betrayed. They felt that the US put too much into this deal at the expense of its relations with the Gulf, that sanctions were lifted, Iran got a lot of money, and not enough consideration was given to security of Gulf countries, their sense of security, and also the way things were weighed in the balance when it came to Syria. It felt as though JCPOA at any cost, no matter what, and that's what the Obama administration pursued, and that was at least the perspective of Gulf countries. How do Gulf countries today look at this changing dynamic in the region? And I know this is not a panel about Iran and how Gulf countries view what's unfolding in Iran, but it does provide an opportunity and an opening for closer discussions about regional stability, between Gulf countries and the US? And then I'll follow up with a question about OPEC and where we are a month after the decision of the cuts.
Yeah, very loaded question. But I think what we need to first understand is that there isn't a coherent Gulf policy.
Fair enough.
So when we are talking about Gulf states, we say that in general, but you're talking about at least six different sets of policies. What Qatar follows, what Kuwait and Oman are not necessarily the same as Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates. As you know, the nuclear deal was conducted through a secret negotiation, initially in Muscat, the capital of Oman, and then when it became public, it went to Vienna, and the whole idea was to limit the Iranian ambitions for enriching uranium and reaching nuclear capability. The Gulf states, the other Gulf states, at least felt that they were not consulted. And maybe that is true to only a small extent, because I have been speaking to people who were involved in these negotiations, and I have been told that the Gulf states were consulted all the way, and they knew of all the discussions that are taking place, and they've told the Americans and the Europeans, go ahead, we're behind you, but we don't want to be seen in the front. I think that may be a strategy that they followed, but I think the mistake that was done, it's not the agreement itself, it's what followed after the agreement. Having reached the agreement in itself was a milestone, and it was very complicated technical negotiations that took place, and you could not have added other elements to it, like Iranian ambitions in the region, Iranian policies in the region, etc., etc. It would have been very, very difficult, and this is, I have been told by people who negotiated this agreement from both sides, from the Iranian side and from the European and American side. But what I think was the mistake was the fact that after the JCPOA was signed, there was no other negotiation, track 2 or track 1, that took place between Iran and European countries and the United States, and also the Gulf countries, who were publicly, they were shocked with the agreement, but in fact they knew all about it all the time. Now the problem is we in a region, in the Gulf region in particular, we have two hegemonic countries, regional countries, and that is on one hand Iran and the other hand Saudi Arabia, and the competition between them actually does raise a lot of questions as to the future of the region. I think both countries have to realize that none of them will be able to dominate the whole region. There are small countries that they will always find ways to hedge their bets and deal with other countries as well, and bring in international partners, regional partners, etc. What is needed is an agreement between Saudi Arabia, particularly, and Iran. Now, I understand there are negotiations going on. It has moved from low-level security talks to diplomatic talks, and I think the challenges that are facing the region in terms of climate change, which is being talked about, the economic challenges, unemployment, youth explosion, etc., are going to push these countries to work together. And I think the belief has started to kind of finally drop in some of the leaders' perception, and we are seeing some negotiation. Now, is this going to be a trend that is going to take us further towards future peaceful cooperation in the region, is one thing, or is it just a period that we are going through because of the changes in the United States policies, the idea that the United States is going to withdraw from the region, and because of all the the conflicts that are taking place. Is it pushing them towards it for long term, or is it a short term? It's very, very difficult to tell. But I do hope that this is going to be a long term thing, because the region needs to move beyond this conflictual relations.
I think it also depends, as Karim was saying, about the outcome of the protests in Iran. But thank you for reminding us about...
Do you mind me if I just add something?
Sure.
I think the outcome of the protest is important, and I agree with Karim. But I think that what is much more important is the succession
Of course,
in Iran.
absolutely.
It's absolutely important for all of us in the region.
And thank you for reminding us that the Gulf is not just one, monolithic block, just as the Middle East is not just one monolithic block. We sometimes forget to ourselves to make those nuances, even though we're from the region. And thank you also for reminding us about the role that Oman played in those nuclear negotiations, and the role that Oman continues to play in many of the efforts to mediate certain disputes or release prisoners in the region. It is an effort and a role to be lauded. If we focus on the US and the various Gulf countries, and they don't always see eye to eye within the Gulf or within OPEC about what should be done when it comes to decisions of oil production. I mean, we saw some of the tussle inside OPEC in November. The decision was to cut production, and the Emiratis made it known that they were against the decision, but it went ahead, and it provoked rage in Washington. It was felt in Washington as a betrayal. And yet oil prices did not go up. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, they went down. So the Saudis could say, well, we were right. And the December meeting just a few days ago kept things as they are. So, a month after this uproar about what the Saudis were doing and how much they're hedging their bets, is it still fair, or was it ever fair, as we heard coming from Washington and the Biden administration, to say that the Saudis are siding with the Russians? Explain to us a little bit more how they're hedging their bets, and whether the Saudis, and I know you don't speak for them, but in terms of, as an analyst, are they turning their back to America and trying to find the best partners out there? And how, and if that's not it, because I don't think that's it, how are they hedging their bets? Because I assume the Saudis also know that when it comes to their protection and security, even if the Americans don't always show up, the Russians and the Chinese aren't going to show up either when it comes to the tension with Iran. So walk us through the hedging and how they play America to their advantage whenever they can.
Okay, I think...
Just easy questions.
Yes, very easy question. I think the Gulf states are sending several messages here to their international partners, and of course to the United States, that they are particularly very unhappy with US policies in the region. And this US policy in the region is not necessarily of today. It's a policy that's been going on for a long time. The idea about the Palestinian question, the two-state solution, the deal of the century, and the war in Yemen, invasion of Iraq. All of these issues that have been talked about in the previous panel has actually driven not only the public in the Gulf and the Middle East away from US policies, but now, which is really important and significant, is also driving the leaderships that were actually allies with the United States, is driving them away from the US. They see an opportunity where there are budding global powers, and there are opportunities there that they can deal with. They're sending messages to the United States that you are not the only partner that we have. There are other ways that we can do things. They're trying to also send to the United States a message that our national interests and our national economy is much more important than what is going on. And we know what we're going to do with our oil, and we know what is the best for the price. So they're trying to send several messages at different levels as well. And I think they, deep inside, they believe that neither China nor Russia are there to protect them. They still believe that the United States is still the only significant power, although they have started to have some doubts about their credibility, especially when Saudi Arabia oil installations were attacked, etc. And of course, the U.S. policy towards the Arab Spring, all of that. So they see that the United States is not necessarily going to be there when you need it. So they are trying to send the message, don't forget us. We are capable of making our own decisions. We know our best, what is best for our own interest, and they see that because they have an economic challenge that is taking place, and you have to remember that since 2014 the oil prices have been going down, and this is an opportunity for them to make an advantage of what is going on, and they cannot take another dip in the oil price, or at least a large dip. So they see that their relationship with Russia in terms of at least stabilizing the price and making it to their own advantage is very important. It's much more significant than anything else, because that economic challenge is quite huge in the region. How can you deliver Vision 2030 or 2035 or 2040 if you don't have oil income at a certain level? So they see this as the first priority, the first national priority. And therefore, they're sending messages to their partners that we will work with Russia. It's our partner in OPEC+. We will try and protect the oil price because it's important. And, we will try and, of course, deal with and supply Europe, and because it's affected by this. And they also understand at the end of the day that the competition for their oil and gas comes from the United States as well, with the shale gas and the shale oil, etc. So they're sending a number of messages there. And I think, as you correctly said, despite the fact that there were certain people who were very upset with their decision, it proved that they were actually right. If they had increased,
and so a month later, after the headlines of betrayal in Washington, how would you characterize, as far as you know, how would you characterize the current state of the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, in your perspective, from your perspective?
I think it's currently very low. I think still very low, and I think there isn't much trust in this relationship. I think the United States leadership were very upset with the visit and the outcome of the visit of Biden to Saudi Arabia, how he was not only treated, but what he had requested has not been met. Saudi Arabia as well is trying to send messages to the Biden administration. This is more than just a national interest and a coalition of national interests. It's also a personal issue. We really have to take that into consideration, especially when we talk about countries like in the Gulf, where foreign policies is made by one person and not an institution and a large government. So the way that Biden has described MBS and has described Saudi Arabia is seen as something that is of insult to the Saudis, and they are trying to hit back. And they see that now this is their opportunity to do so. And but the popularity of MBS in Saudi Arabia is shooting up because of the way that he treated the leader of the most powerful country.
They have to be careful, because when push comes to shove, if they need protection, they better hope the Americans show up.
I totally agree. I totally agree.
And of course, we don't hear enough from the dissident voices within Saudi Arabia, because there is also a climate of fear within the country, despite all the social and cultural improvements. Talking about hedging, Sinan, I want to come to you. Can Turkey continue to balance its ties to the West and Russia as it has done? We're talking about omni-alignment just now. Perhaps you can expand on that. And how does, the war in Ukraine and Russia's war on Ukraine and its invasion of Ukraine affect how Turkey calculates and recalculates at the moment?
The war in Ukraine tended to validate Turkey's approach, because indeed the balancing act is a difficult one for an ally. And here I just want to pause a moment to describe why Turkey is in a peculiar position. Because what we've seen over the years is a transformation of a relationship from an alliance to a purely transactional one. And the difference is, when you start to think about what characterizes a purely transactional relationship versus an alliance relationship, it's basically about delayed gratification. In other words, in a purely transactional relationship, the cost and benefits are almost overnight. You commit something, you get something back in return, and everybody walks on their, In an alliance relationship, it's about delayed gratification. You do something for your ally, and you expect that trust to help you going forward. That's the core of an alliance relationship. It's a bit like these experiments that they do with little kids. I'm sure you may have seen them.
The marshmallows.
Exactly, the marshmallows. They put a small kid in a room, and they put one marshmallow in front of the kid and tell them, look, you can eat this, but we're going to come back in the room in 3 minutes. And if you have not, then we'll give you 4 more marshmallows, and you get to eat 5 marshmallows. So the more patient kid, resists the urge of instant gratification, and therefore the delayed gratification, he gets 5 marshmallows. That's what defines an alliance relationship. And ultimately, we need to go back there. So the question to me is, with this balancing, with this urge of balancing, which I think is also a systemic response to what we're seeing around the world. The rise of big power competition, the dominant strategy, as I talked in the first round, that this leads to thinking of a more balanced approach of trying to hedge, of trying to establish relations with many of these, powers at the same time. But ultimately, the conundrum facing Turkish policymakers is that the balancing should not come at the detriment of the alliance relationship. And here, there are lessons learned on the US side, and there are lessons to be learned on the Turkish side. Ultimately, it's about drawing Turkey back in an enhanced matrix of benefits, which today Ankara does not see. And that's part of the urge for this balancing act. So how do we build up that matrix of enhanced benefits for Turkey? And here, it's not perhaps just about the US, it's also about Europe, because this needs to entail a security angle, it needs to entail a technology angle, it needs to entail an economic angle, and it's really about the transatlantic bond per se, not just the US relationship. But for the US side also, the lesson to be learned is that this vision, which is somewhat replicated in the US security strategy, of trying to impose an artificially simple order on the world, which is defined in bipolar and binary terms, autocracies versus democracies, allies versus non-allies, is not going to work. And I think we need a degree of nuance here from the standpoint of US policymakers to acknowledge the reality on the ground that this is not how things are shaped. That this big power competition opens up space for countries that are willing to demonstrate a higher degree of strategic autonomy. And I think the US needs to acknowledge this, otherwise we're heading into a very difficult context of relationship. But if we get that sort of acknowledgement, then it's easier to build up mutually beneficial relations. But short of that acknowledgement, it's going to be much more, friction-prone relationship.
And it requires US adaptability and,
Yes.
and the willingness to see the positive in that. Zaha, I want to come back to you in Washington and look a little bit at the effect of the Israeli elections and the new right-wing government that we have. How does that affect the calculations of the US in terms of what can be done or not when it comes to the Abraham Accords and the depressurizing of the region? And then I'll follow up a bit later on with another question about the Palestinians.
I mean, definitely, you're seeing now an administration that's trying to recalibrate or to consider the way in which it's going to approach the particular members of what looks like is going to be the new Israeli government. In particular, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who are looking at holding, these new manufactured and rejiggered ministries that sort of take responsibilities from the defense ministry or create whole new ministries that really allow them to have complete control over the Palestinian citizens and policing over them and over Palestinians and living in East Jerusalem and over Palestinians in the occupied territories, those in particular living in Area C, which is where the Israeli settlements are in the West Bank and where 300,000 Palestinians live. So the U.S. is talking about, what best practices and protocols to adopt in dealing with these individuals, when I think it's really missing the mark here. These negative trend lines that have been pushing agendas that are looking to really force Palestinians out of both Israel and the occupied territories have been longstanding and going on for decades. And unless the U.S. addresses these trend lines and rethinks its approach to Israel, its unconditional approach to the Israel-U.S. bilateral relationship, it's going to encounter difficulties in pursuing not only the two-state solution, but as you point out, it's going to have implications for regional integration, Israel's normalization within the Middle East. As I mentioned earlier, it's clear that the Arab constituencies across the Middle East are not in support of normalization, while what many legal experts, human rights organizations, both in Israel and internationally, call apartheid. As long as you have a situation, and we see this speeding up now with the emergence of these political parties and the amount of power they're wielding in Israeli political spaces, as long as you have these trends going forward, it's going to be incredibly difficult for the U.S. to pursue regional integration. And in particular, the U.S. has been spearheading a lot of the efforts around, getting Arab actors together with Israelis to pursue things like climate change, to pursue, energy deals that will be mutually beneficial to those countries. But in the process, it's not putting in place any kind of guardrails to prevent those regional agreements from blurring distinctions between Israel and the occupied territories. So in effect, in its efforts to pursue this, regional integration, it's completely undermining Palestinian sovereignty in a future Palestinian state. And just as an example, this recent deal that was Secretary Kerry worked very hard on with respect to the UAE, Israel, Jordan energy water nexus deal. In order to actually implement that, you're going to have the electric utility lines going through at least partially the West Bank. And the question is, to what extent are Palestinians going to benefit from solar energy produced in Jordan going into the West Bank? And to what extent might that actually be facilitating Israeli expansion of settlements there? These kinds of questions, I mean, putting aside the fact that Palestinians weren't brought into that deal, these kinds of questions aren't being addressed. And so it's going to really complicate U.S. efforts to get to deepen and broaden Arab governments and the regional integration and normalization with Israel. And it's going to encounter sort of a backlash, I believe. So long as the human rights situation is not being dealt with on the ground, these kinds of initiatives can't succeed and won't be successful, in my view.
Zaha, thank you. A quick follow-up, just briefly, if you can tell us a little bit more about the increased energy cooperation between Israel and Egypt. In the wake of the Ukraine war, they've also signed a memorandum of understanding to supply gas from Israel to Europe via Egypt. Is this a net positive for the region, for only Egypt and Israel, for the US? How do you see that, just briefly, and then I'll go around again to the others.
Again, this will really depend on the extent to which Palestinians are brought in and the extent to which Palestinians benefit. We have an extremely dire situation in Gaza where there is no access to clean water unless you're talking about purchases from Israel or Egypt or some of the few desalination plants. So energy is really critical to Gaza. It still doesn't get energy full-time. Electricity is not a full-time prospect in Gaza. So, it's critically important for the survival of Palestinians living in Gaza to have access to water and energy. So the extent to which these kinds of deals actually benefit Palestinians and don't enable and entrench Israeli occupation is really going to be critical to their success.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a few more questions. We'll sort of start to draw towards the end of the session. For those of you following us online, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box, and the lovely organizers will bring them to me, and I'll also be taking questions from the audience in the last 10 minutes. But I want to take a bit of a step back for the end of the session and ask some sort of broad questions. And I want to look at the opportunities here for the United States, because in moments of flux, there are opportunities for everyone. Some people are hedging. The US is looking at a world where, as the Biden administration likes to say it, it's a battle between autocracy and democracy. I think it's better to phrase it as democratic values versus autocratic tendencies, because the fight for civil rights and democratic values happens even within countries that are autocracies. And we've seen that this is a moment of weakness for autocracies, from Russia to China to Iran, which are having their systems challenged by their citizens. Karim, I want to turn to you and follow up and ask you to follow up on that. What is the opportunity here for the US, but also the possible pitfalls? And you can stick to just Iran or broaden it from here to the region. Obviously, no one wants to see the US pursue regime change anywhere. Equally, Iranian protesters want moral support, and they're not going to get it from Russia or China. Russia is also quite busy with Ukraine and is paying less attention to Syria. That creates an opening there. How do you see it, Karim? You're sitting in Washington, you follow Iran, and obviously you follow the globe. So tell us more about this moment of weakness for autocracies and how it looks from your perspective. I think you're on mute, Karim.
Sorry about that. So 2 broad points. One is that the United States cannot simultaneously downgrade its presence in the Middle East and downgrade its partnerships in the region. You can't do both at the same time, because you're essentially going to cede that space to China and Russia. So if after 2 decades there's a bipartisan consensus in the United States that we would like to reduce our presence in the region, that means upgrading our regional partnerships. And as Sinan said, that binary which we like to frame things through, dictatorship, autocracy, dictatorships versus democracy, U.S. ally versus U.S. adversary, that's challenging in the region because there's arguably no or very few, maybe one, two democracies in the region. So we don't have the luxury of choosing Scandinavian partners in the Middle East. Second is that I remember, Kim, in 2003, in the run-up to the Iraq War, there was a debate in Washington whether the road to peace in the region went through Jerusalem or went through Baghdad, right? Those who argued the latter, there were proponents of the Iraq War. Many of the opponents of the Iraq War said, no, to achieve peace in the region, we need an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal. I would argue that that neither of those places are the place where you would want to, neither Jerusalem nor Baghdad, I would argue, provide you with the road to peace in the region. In my view, when I look at Iran's presence, it's has enormous influence in 4 failed states, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. And as long as the United States feels that, we like to say that we're not going to meddle in Iran's internal affairs, but the reality is that Russia and China are abetting the Islamic Republic of Iran. Certainly Russia feels it has a strong interest in the Iranian regime remaining in power. And I think that understandably, after the failures of Iraq and Afghanistan, and frankly, the failures of the Arab uprising, there's a lack of confidence in Washington that the United States can play a constructive role in supporting representative government as we did during the Cold War. But I think that's really a lack of creativity. And there are many ways in which you can provide creative and intelligence assistance, which I don't think that we're even thinking about right now. So yes, just to close here, for the last several years, it appeared that there was democracy was on the back foot, and autocracies were strong and here to stay. But I do think that at some point, autocracies, lack of deliverance for their own societies starts to catch up on them, as we see now in Iran.
Thank you, Karim. I'll turn to the audience now if there are any questions, and we'll continue the conversation with the panelists. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. There'll be a microphone coming to you. While we wait for questions, Abdullah, Karim makes a great point about the fact that the US cannot at the same time retreat from the region and downgrade its partnerships. If it wants to retreat from the region but maintain its interests, it has to maintain its partnerships with its regional allies who can then deliver for American interests. Do you agree with that statement? And how do you think, what would your advice be to the US, to the Biden administration, about how it balances that?
Well, I think it is maybe an overestimation to think that that the US is going to retreat from the region. The US has invested a large amount of money, energy, interest in the region, and has a lot of connections and a lot of strategic interest that it cannot just leave the region behind. And even if it wants to go to the Indo-Pacific region, they still have to go through the Middle East region. No other hegemonic power has ignored the Middle East in the past. So the Middle East will remain, because of the virtue of its strategic geography and location, it will always be very important.
But how should the US think creatively in terms of how it engages with the Middle East that does not repeat past patterns, but sets it up for success at this moment of transition, if you're looking at it from an American perspective?
I think what we tend to do here in the Middle East is that we blame the United States for everything, for all our faults. I think many of the mistakes that have been made are also made by us and by our leaderships in the region, by our people. However, the United States also is there to blame, and we cannot just ignore them. Because of it is, I feel like, hegemonic power. Because of it is relationship with some of the states in the region. They could have avoided some of the issues. You know, we've talked about them in the past. The war in the invasion of Kuwait, the invasion of Iraq, even the war in Yemen. The United States could have prevented as well. They need to have a strategy regarding, you know, the ongoing and the deep crisis that we all face here, which is the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian issue. We can't just ignore that and just keep, you know, making statements like that. And it has an influence, and it can actually play a very important role, instead of just, you know, supporting the Abraham Accord, which is, as you know, as good as we see it, or at least some people say it, it's not serving the interest of either the Palestinians nor the Israelis. The United States also had to kind of consider that this region is important for them, and they have to not only think about it as a region where they can serve their interest, as it were, and sell their arms to them and arms sales, but also in terms of economic development. What has the United States done in terms of getting these countries to work together in terms of economic development? What kind of projects have we seen that involves the United States that bring these countries together? Why can't the region itself, with the support of the United States, start to think differently and start to think outside the box by creating their own regional mechanism? Because this is a region that is plagued by so many conflicts, and there is hardly any overarching regional body. I'm not saying that the United States can come and do that, but it created the conditions whereby this kind of a regional mechanism could evolve, that involves all regional countries. Because at the moment, despite all these conflicts and the challenges we are talking about, you know, the Arab League is in tatters, the Gulf Cooperation Council.
And that's something that we are responsible for in the region, the inability also to cooperate amongst each other.
But the United States can help to create this by not to interfere too much as well, and let the other countries. The moment that the United States decided that they were to withdraw, or there were announcements, we've seen that some of the countries in the Middle East started to work together. We've seen Iran, Saudi Arabia, we've seen Turkey, UAE, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. So with the United States being what it is, and, you know, with their policies in the region at the moment, it's also intentionally or unintentionally stopping these countries to work together. But the moment that they said they were going to withdraw, or there was this concept of withdrawal, we've seen a very strong, a very quick diplomatic movement taking place.
Thank you. Yazid, we have a question from you.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to go back to...
And if you can specify who the question is addressed to.
Mainly, I guess, to Abdullah Baabood, possibly Karim Sadjadpour might want to jump in as well. So I want to go back to how GCC states have dealt with what they see as an Iranian threat. And obviously, that was one of the elements underpinning relations for decades with the United States, i.e. that the US would be there to protect them from Iran. Now, following the JCPOA, the GCC states had the option, if they felt betrayed by the US or, you know, less protected, of coming to terms with Iran. I mean, that would have been one option. Another, you know, they seem to have played with as well, was to come closer to Israel, especially for the UAE, Saudi Arabia less so. But that doesn't seem to have been a sufficient response either, a counterweight to the Iranian threat. What I'm puzzled by is none of this amounts to a genuine strategy, i.e., they're neither sucking up to Iran and trying to deflect its sort of threat, nor effectively countering it with a military response capability, which doesn't include the US. And China, I could imagine, getting closer to China could offer a means maybe of mediating with Iran, given China-Iran relations or interests as well in the sort of gas oil sector. But again, that doesn't seem to amount to a strategy either.
We're actually reaching the end of the panel, so can I ask Abdullah and Karim to give us their sort of 30-second summary to this rather big question?
This is a $6 million question that we ask ourselves in the
Do you have
region.
$6
Why?
million?
Why don't they do so? For example, why they even creating the GCC as a regional organization, a security bloc, itself is not working. So they, as you correctly said, they don't have any kind of security arrangement vis-a-vis Iran if they think that Iran is a threat, nor do they have one strategy towards Iran. So it's a very, very perplexing kind of a situation. I think the future is to have something that is much more inclusive, and that is to include Iran. Whatever Iran political system is, or whatever their ideology, it's up to them. But we can, they can be included even as part of the GCC or another mechanism that can include, like for example, the ASEAN that has other powers involved in there, and maybe that way, following a policy of inclusion rather than exclusion, is something that could help us all together to at least start a dialogue.
Karim, 30 seconds. Do you agree with Dr. Abdullah? Do you think there is a way of including Iran, or does Iran first have to make some goodwill gestures?
You can include Iran as long as you have a system in Iran which sees itself as a revolutionary cause, not a nation state. I'll just say this. I spent a year in Lebanon in 2003 as a Fulbright scholar. And one of the profound lessons I learned that year is that it takes decades and maybe centuries to build something, and it takes weeks to destroy it. And Iran is not in the business of building things. Iran and its proxy are in the business of destroying things. And so you have Gulf countries which are trying to build things, and Iran via its proxies, whether that's the Houthis or others, all they need to do is to launch missiles and drones and strikes at Burj Khalifa and Aramco. And that's very difficult for Gulf countries to come up on their own with a military strategy to defend themselves against that. And so if they feel that the United States doesn't have their back, obviously they're going to hedge with Russia and China. But it is very difficult for them to come up with a surefire strategy against a neighbor which is not trying to build anything, just wants to destroy things.
We have to wrap up, but I would like to give Zaha and Sinan 30 seconds each. If you have 30 seconds with President Biden, what would be your one piece of advice for how they should handle Turkey? Sinan.
Well, not just Turkey, but the region. Animal farm.
Animal farm.
Yep. Animal farm.
Okay.
Because the systemic difficulties that the US has and will continue to have in terms of engagement with the region that we talked about, credibility, durability of the commitment and the validity, will necessarily push these countries towards this omni-alignment strategy. And there the US needs to manage these expectations. So animal farm, why? Because all animals were created equal, but some were more equal than others. I think that's the expectation that the US should set. Yes, we agree that you should have these different relationships, but ultimately on important matters, you should side with us.
Okay.
And this is how you build up and strengthen the partnerships that Karim talked about. But you need to start by acknowledging the reality on the ground, which is big power competition and omni-alignment.
Zaha, we're not going to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in 30 seconds, but if you had one piece of advice to give, what would it be?
Well, if I'm making an elevator pitch to President Biden, I probably push the emergency button in the elevator and hold it right there.
Or longer than 30 seconds.
And tell him that a wait and see approach with this new Israeli government, when you have political platforms that are pretty clear, and when you have cabinet positions that are poised to allow them to pursue their agenda, is not a good approach. We need red lines right now, and we need some real conditionality in the relationship to prevent what could be serious human rights violations moving forward.
Thank you, Zaha. I would caution against any president putting red lines, because that didn't work very well for President Obama in 2013. But I take your point, and we'll look for that emergency button in the elevator. That's all we have time for. Thank you to Karim, Zaha in Washington and New York, Abdullah, Sinan with me here on stage. For those of us watching us online, that's it for us in Beirut. Thank you very much for tuning in. For those of you who are here in the room, there'll be some closing remarks momentarily. Thank you very much.